the editor and owner of two magazines, the Ojai Quarterly and the Ojai Monthly, and the host of the Ojai podcast, Talk of the Town. His first writing job was as a reporter, and bear with me, I will get you guys set up with these speakers before you have to talk. Anyway, his first writing job was as a reporter for the Kern Valley Sun in the Southern Sierras, where he worked for 10 years, the last seven of those years as editor and publisher. He's also been a reporter, editor, and publisher of the Eastern Arizona Courier, Copper Era, Douglas Daily Dispatch, Sierra Vista Herald, and the Ojai Valley News, and he currently lives in Ojai, California. Thank you for joining us. Our other speaker is Kevin Davis, who is a lecturer and author and has worked with independent news and media organizations around the globe. He's the principal consultant and founder of KLJD Consulting, helping news, media, and civic tech organizations become sustainable businesses. In 2009, he was the inaugural CEO and executive director of the Institute for Nonprofit News, a consortium of nonprofit newsrooms in the United States. For the organization's first 5 years of operation, he oversaw efforts to promote sustainability of its member organizations and increase the impact of public service journalism by nonprofits online. For the past 5 years, Kevin has focused his work on helping media and technology companies that are focused on journalism and civic engagement achieve greater impact and become sustainable businesses. Some of his clients include Harkin, Ground Source, Southern California Public Radio, and our favorite, ARP. He also currently lives in Ojai. Bear with me as I get them set up with these microphones.
Coming out, and thanks Betsy for the introduction. I don't know if you know that her distinguished career as a doctor, but I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for her, because I had a terrible case of indigestion about 12 years ago, and I just finally went to the ER, and she got me on an ambulance and down to the hospital, and within 45 minutes they had a tube up my groin and put a stent in my heart, and I think the whole thing took less than an hour before I was in recovery. It was her foresight, so thanks, Betsy. And great to see all these Ojai people here. Yeah, thank you. I know, Ojai in the house. And you should be grateful that we're here, because it's probably about 20 degrees warmer in Ojai right now, maybe 25. So we figured the first thing we'd do is a little context about the history of how we got where we are to set up the context for our discussion. You know, newspapers in recognizable form, 1453, the printing press came out. It was a very explosive time with Protestant revolutions and everything else, and there were tracts and pamphlets that got handed out and, furiously dispatched all across Europe and all into China, and it just happened so quickly. But newspapers recognizably, a compendium of what's going on, as of what's going on in our community and our state, and information that you need. That started in 1603 in Austria, and then it really boomed. And I know in London, the first paper was like 1606. Shakespeare was still writing about the time he came out with Hamlet. As a creative ferment, that sort of English Renaissance. So those newspapers just blew up all over the place. And one of the interesting consequences of those early newspapers, still in London, were dragon sightings of dragons got further and further from London. And I think as a metaphor for the value of local journalism, keeping those dragons away, that's probably as good a stand-in as any. So the penny press was where, before most of the newspapers sorted themselves out into political alignments, like they were party organs that they would use to attack their opponents and support their friends and allies. And journalism is sort of an independent from the organizations, and the standalone business model was like the New York Herald in the 1830s. James Bennett, the publisher, came up with the penny press, and you know, they were lurid tales, mostly what we would call clickbait today, about gruesome beheadings and lovers running off and, you know, children falling over a cliff and things of that nature. But probably by the 1860s, 1870s, New York Times and Chattanooga News Press, there were newspapers that sorted as unbiased as they could, which that model, that sort of Walter Lippmann model of being an honest broker really took root like 1920s, you know, towards the tail end of the Progressive era, which is when the League of Women Voters came on board, right, with suffrage and, you know, as part of the Progressive era, which I feel like, you know, I'm in the Rotary Club, so is Kevin, a few of you others out here. I know Judy's husband. It's great to see you. There's a lot of Progressive era momentum and cultural DNA that brings us together, and that's where the overlap with, you know, the local journalism. So I was gonna, like Kevin, kind of set us up, you know. You want to pick it up with like
Sure.
social media?
Yeah, well, actually, let me do a little history lesson of my own. So, in Ventura County in 1890, the population was 10,071 people.
Wow.
We had 13 papers.
Wow.
In 2020, the last census, which I think our population was 843,843, but give or take. 16. That's it. So the number of outlets serving our communities in Ventura County, it has greatly been reduced. Furthermore, ownership of those news organizations, when you look outside of the independents, the OVNs of the world, when we look at VC Star is owned by an organization in McLean, Virginia, who has previously shut down long-standing news organizations without notice, or sold them to, shall we say, venture capital firms that are more interested in the real estate of these news organizations than they are in the reporting. This is our issue, right? And so one of the questions that we were posed was, well, how does local journalism relate to civics, right? Well, on the most obvious level, we need independent editorial to evaluate candidates and to evaluate the different proposals. Now, interestingly, I worked a lot in nonprofit news, but nonprofit newsrooms are actually not allowed to endorse candidates, while for-profit newsrooms are. But my point here is this, which is there is a direct correlation between the amount of independent reporting being done in our county and civic engagement, right? And that has been proven across the country. So this is not something unique to Ventura County, but we have a unique opportunity, which is why we are starting the First Amendment Foundation in Ventura County, which is a new type of organization called Community News Fund. So there's an organization called Report for America. They're a national organization, and they help put young reporters into newsrooms that need it, and they help the newsroom then ramp up to help cover the cost of that additional headcount. So Report for America did a report recently called Community News Funds. And these are happening all over the country, including California. Cal Matters, which is based in Sacramento.
That's important. You should give them some primer about Cal Matters. I think it's an important model that has shown success. And
We can't hear you at all.
The speaker has to be facing out.
Aim it at us.
Say it again.
Aim it right. Turn it around.
Cal Matters.
Turn it
No,
around.
turn around.
Yeah. There we
Now
go.
you've covered
Cal
it up.
Matters.
Put your hand away from it.
That's why you
Cal
can
Matters. Cal does matter. I want Kevin to tell you about
Okay,
that.
all right.
So Cal Matters is a statewide nonprofit newsroom in Sacramento. Started about 6 or 7 years ago, and they cover Sacramento. And what they do here is we can read some of their content in the pages of the VC Star, because they give that content, possibly for a fee, maybe not, to the VC staffer usage so that they have increased reach. And this is how we're seeing this hybrid approach now across the country to fill in gaps in our information. These are called news deserts, right? There are over 100 cities, no, excuse me, I got the number completely wrong. I'm not going to cite that because I don't have the number at hand, but there are many communities in our country that are frankly, have population sizes very similar to what we have, where there is no local news whatsoever. So what happens is the local papers can't afford to hire people. They fill their pages with syndicated content, which is typically national and typically polarizing. So my theory, our theory of change, is that local news inherently should be not framed within the national politic, but instead should be relevant to all of the residents of our region, such that they want to seek out credible sources of information and inform themselves before they go to the voting, before they mail in their ballot. So that's the long-winded response to why local news really matters and how it relates to civics.
Well, measures A and B might be a good proximate example of how that can happen. I'm not sure what your takes are, and I respect it either way. There was a flood. Pardon?
They endorsed it.
Yes. Well, then you know how that happened, where the airways were flooded. You couldn't pick up anytime anybody came into Ventura County, they were bombarded with oil company inducements and importunments with it's misinformation, or at least it's not the full picture. And so it passed.
We don't know that yet.
It's interesting. No, not yet.
No,
Oh, but the numbers are looking extremely bad for the
let's
yes.
not say it's over before it's
Okay,
over.
Andra, I
Okay,
accept
well
that.
let me rephrase.
But
The
let's just keep
VC
that
Star has
apart,
reported that it's losing.
I know that.
Yeah. But that's an example of, even if it didn't pull it out at the end, of how money can skew information and make a dent. Even bad information can be stickier than good information. We'd love to think that there's this perfect marketplace of ideas where good information will push out bad information. I think we've learned over the past decade or so that that's not always the case, that there's a human nature to just go where the noise is, and that's a threat.
If I may. So we know that the No campaign spent 8x on the Yes campaign. And so traditionally when you have that, this is the largest expenditure I think in Ventura County. When you have a healthy, thriving news ecosystem with independent editorial and people trusting those news sources, there was a time where, frankly, the editorial departments of papers could make or break an initiative. Today, with the weakness in the local sector, we just don't have enough people reading these incredibly important local institutions that we will not get back if we let them go. They will be replaced by something different, which, depending on your age group, may or may not be appealing. But my point here is that this is how local news relates to civics. Nowadays, people can outspend and know that there won't be an editorial, independent view that will take a keen eye to these issues. And so we are playing into the hands of special interests that can raise money effectively and bring it in. And one way to combat that, of course, is to invest more heavily in local news and get people and tell people to read it, watch it, and listen to it. One more point. I'm gonna have a few actually.
That's why we're here.
How many people, raise their hands, currently get their news mainly local news, mainly from print? So an actual print product that is shipped to your house. So print, no print as in ink goes on paper, paper gets delivered. Okay.
More hands go
How
down.
many people here currently get their local news predominantly from digital sources, text digital sources? Okay. How many people here predominantly get the local news from YouTube? Wow, I bet you ask that question in high school, you're going to get some different responses. How many people get their local news from a podcast? Okay. So depending on the age group of the audience, you'll see different hands going up. And this is what we have to realize, which is the local news environment is not about newspapers. It's about the entire multimedia ecosystem, including non-professional channels like Nextdoor and Facebook. Thank you. Yeah. So the issue then becomes, so if we're going to objectively ask ourselves, how do we inform our local residents? How do we inform the populace so that they get more engaged? We need to be strategic. Where should the money go? Well, we know we need investigative journalism. We know we need to we need to be the voice for the voiceless and be a watchdog in society. That is the antiseptic, incredibly pro-social function of a functioning fourth estate. Let's make no mistake about it. It's not about ads and clicks. It's about keeping bad guys at bay.
Or at least bringing them out into the light.
Or bring them out into the light.
There's a disturbing trend going on, which has really upset, mostly in the Midwest, but it's growing, where there's disinformation campaigns that will source a local story about whatever it happens to be, usually something, city council demands woke training for police officers or something like that. And they'll take something and blow it all up out of proportion. And then it'll make its way up through the conservative media stream to Fox News and Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity and such. But then you go back to the source, it'd be the Waukesha Times. And then you dig in, there's no Waukesha Times. It's, what do you call those? Not a false front, but a cutout. It's just made specifically to disseminate talking points for the national media about how everything's going to hell in a handbasket. And they're using the front of it being, this is the local journalists that have uncovered this school board run crazily awakened. And it's just happened another. And then the other thing is all the local stations, especially your broadcast stations, getting bought out by Sinclair, where they're forcing opinions down to the local level, because your local broadcaster still has credibility in a way that the major national networks don't. You trust your local weatherman, but what if your local weatherman is then not maybe forced but encouraged to do editorials that promote their particular point of view that Sinclair wants to promote, and bring that discord and that polarization right into your local community? So there's two threats. One coming from, they're taking these false front operations, these cutouts that are supposed to be local newspapers they only exist as online disinformation content gatherers. And then you've got Sinclair and these national networks forcing their opinions down into the local broadcast environments.
The other issue we have locally is that most of our local news is in English only, right? We have a very significant population that are Spanish speaking, and we also have a population here that need information that are speaking other languages from Central America that, I'm sorry, I can't remember the name because I'm a bit tired, but the point being is that if we want more engagement, if we want, for example, to fight disinformation around COVID and vaccinations, we need to be having this information out there in more than just English. We can't also build trust in institutions if people only see themselves on the police blotter or as part of a problem, right? We have to build credibility. And frankly, what's happening with a lot of these community news funds around the country where it's working is they'll work with non-traditional partners like churches, and they'll work with civic groups, because we're all trying to serve the same people. And the question then becomes, how do we reach them with the information? It's less about driving people to buy a paper or go to my website so you can click on an ad, and a lot more about how can we better inform you to get you more engaged. Now, here's the financial problem. There's a massive financial problem. If anybody here surprised to learn that the news business is in pretty big trouble? Well, let me give you some data. According to Gallup, American trust and confidence in the mass media to report the news fully, accurately, and fairly has dropped to its lowest level in polling history, down from a high of 72% in 1972 to 29%, putting the US last among 46 countries in trust in media. I also work in Eastern Europe. I work a lot with Ukrainians and former people who grew up in Soviet republics. And their question to me is, America is the shining light of journalism. Why are Americans throwing it away? Why don't Americans get how good we have it, really? And why are Americans not stepping up to put their money where their self-interest is and support local news? Okay? Now, who you support, how you support them, what your political bent is, I'm totally, I don't care, right? We just, if you're getting local information, that has to get paid for, and if you're not paying for it, you're the product.
Absolutely. That is the prime directive of social media. If you're not paying for it, that's what you're being sold.
Yeah.
Packaged up and sliced and diced in millions of different ways. And the micro-targeting, anyone here ever said something, out loud, and then 10 minutes later an ad about some product related to that comes up? Yes, it's spooky.
Listening.
Yes, and this artificial intelligence is really growing exponentially. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing either. It's just having the, we were just talking about civics education in schools. It's been gone. Isn't that what this question was? And how sad is that? Most of you here are old enough to remember how important it was in 9th grade, where you would actually read newspaper editorials and you would listen to a broadcast and you would say, where's the point of view, who's the sourcing, what's the credibility ranking in social studies class and so forth. Mock elections and mock trials, things like that, to learn about the structures of our society. And the more you know, the more you value them. And I see that being degraded. And who does it benefit? That's the other thing. Sui bono, the Romans would say. Who does it benefit? Does it benefit all of us? Does it benefit our communities? I don't think so. I think there's people who benefit from us being alienated and polarized in our little silos.
How do we get people to vote against their own self-interest?
Yeah.
I actually read a wrong quote. I'm going to read another quote going back to what I was saying before. So Pew Research said, in a survey conducted in 2018, found that most Americans think that their local news media are doing fine financially. As a result, listen to this one. As a result, only 14%, 1/4 of Americans surveyed in 2019 said they pay for local news. 1/4. Right? It's not like local news isn't saying. There are people in the room right now who publish news, right? There are people waving their hands saying, we need your support. We are worthy of it. And by the way, when you support us, you're supporting civics. You are supporting society. You are reinforcing the norms of how our democracy works. I personally am here to tell this story 1,000 times because it bears being repeated. And it's in our self-interest to support local news, whether you like the local paper or not, whether you agree with the editorial or not. First thing I do when I move into a town or move into a place, I buy the paper, right? I mean, Laura can to attest. When I first moved to town, first thing I did was buy the paper and reintroduce myself. So we have to also, there's a responsibility here for every activist in the room to reinforce to our social groups the importance of local news. Ask your fellow Ventura County residents, who are you reading? Where are you getting your information from? You say you're against this, why? And have that discourse. But frankly, the news organizations that generate that editorial are the places where that discourse typically starts.
Yeah, there's one of those, what I call like a seminal text, was this book by Robert Putnam that came out in the year 2000 called Bowling Alone, about the decline of social capital in America. This is 2000, and Bowling Alone, he was talking about bowling alleys closing and not reopening, and not because people don't bowl, they don't bowl in leagues anymore, they don't get together around an activity that they share in a communal way. And he was talking about, and this was long before Facebook or Twitter, how communities are the adhesion of how we come together is just slipping. And one of the interesting, there's a lot of interesting facts about this. This book stands up great. It's like a clarion call that happened a long time ago. And all of his research, Robert Putnam's a researcher from Harvard, it just reinforces this notion that it's just getting worse. But he talked about like this range of, you subscribe to a newspaper, you end up being healthier. And how do you make that connection? The more socially engaged someone, and this is very counterintuitive, the more personal contacts that you make with people in a week, the fewer colds that you have. If you have a certain number of personal contacts in the course of a week, you have 50% fewer colds. How is that possible? It's because we're social creatures. We need that engagement. We need to get together at the water well and gossip and chew the fat. It's vital to our identities as the human creatures.
The sense of community and the sense of belonging is essential to us feeling like we're also safe and that we've found a place for our homes and our families. So I'm from the school that you don't come with a problem unless you have a proposed solution.
We call that old school.
And one of the projects that I'm working on, and it feels a little bit like pushing a rock uphill, is a new project called the First Amendment Foundation of Ventura County. Now, interestingly, I first actually met Bret having a conversation about this over a year ago. And when I first was looking at this idea, there wasn't the term community news funds. It was new. Since then, we've seen community news funds crop up all across the country, and while it's still new, it's showing some success. But let me just reinforce what we're trying to do. What would it be? Because it's still in its formative stages, there's no website yet. The objective here is to raise funds on an ongoing basis to help pay for additional content, additional headcount, and give scholarships to local kids to go off to the world and then come back and report, perhaps even start news information services themselves. It is a long-term objective so that we can create these structures so that when you get a grant from us, it's not just for 1 year, ideally, because so I hire somebody and then what happens when the money goes away? I have to fire them. This is the big weakness in nonprofit news, the lack of continuity in funding. So if we can help create these structures, there's a really great chance that we can help not only help strengthen the current news ecosystem, but also grow the news ecosystem in the near future with people native to our county or moved to our county who want to better serve the county with these civic information services, which is what I call news. So that's the idea. I'm going to tell you that it's not going as well as I'd hoped yet, and I'll tell you why, and it's okay. So most community news funds are a collaboration between a newsroom and a community news foundation. A community foundation. So, we have the Ventura County Community Foundation, Silicon Valley Community Foundation has been doing this for many years. When those two come together, typically it works. So the point of having the community foundation involved is it really gives you an imprimatur. It really allows you to say, look, this is something that is valid. So when people of a certain affluence are putting together their donor-advised funds, they'll say, you know what, I want a portion of my funding to go towards local journalism. Secondly, the organization will be using community input to help pick and choose what content and organizations and projects to support, so that it's not being decided by an owner or just an editor in charge. Unfortunately, one of the biggest problems with the current news structure is that you can own a paper and print what you like. The editor-in-chief often are not terribly good at taking input from people that are supporting.
Present company excluded.
I said often. My point being here is this is a structure that's working elsewhere that I'd like to see in Ventura County, Unfortunately, the Community Foundation has still not yet got its head around it, but we're in dialogue with them, and I'm very, very hopeful that we'll convince them, at least working on a pilot project. The other thing, sorry, I've just taken a full-time position, which I haven't fully announced yet, starting in middle July, where I'll be opening up to 8 of these around the country. So I will be working in St. Louis and Detroit and places like that to establish these community news runs there, working with old media in those community foundations.
Hopefully you can get some proof of concept and get a program, a process that you can bring back.
So there are 2 things I could ask of you. The first is, if you are in dialogue with the Community Foundation, make sure they understand that we believe local journalism is something that should be a strategic of importance today and cannot wait for a new strategic plan and then maybe we'll get to it in 4 years. Like 4 years is going to be too late. So anything we can do.
You want evidence? You look at this gorgeous valley. Is that the Conejo Valley behind us here?
Cabrio Plain.
Well, if you look at this beautiful farmland, you can see these McMansion developments sprouting up around the edges. You can see the traffic on the 101. You can see the threats that we're facing here. And it doesn't feel like we're sharing some community identity that, like Kevin's saying, a countywide news enterprise could supply that can help us organize against these threats like we do in Ojai, where we've got uranium mines and phosphate pits and gravel trucks and landfills coming in every decade or so. There's an existential threat, and the community that rallies around that can prevent this gorgeous valley in front of us from becoming sprawl, from becoming Encino East or Encino West, or what's up there, Northridge, I guess. But yeah, it's waiting. It's lurking over the hills, waiting to spill down in here. And if we're better organized and better informed, we can make better choices.
That's it. I mean, that's the whole play right there, right? If we want to improve civic engagement, we've got to better inform our populace. So the second thing I'd like to ask you to do is really think about how you include local journalism in your media diet and in your giving, right? Not everybody can give. So a subscription or a membership is very helpful, but leaving money to news organizations in ways that through institutions, and there are, besides the First Amendment Foundation, there are 300-400 non-profit news organizations around the country that you could put your money into. But put your money locally, please. You know, buy a local paper, subscribe to the VC Star, engage, and promote how important local journalism is for our mutual, benefit. This is a symbiotic relationship we're looking for. While we want to be at arm's length from the money sources, so government money is kind of interesting because we don't really want it. We want advertising for a lot of folks. But the fact is that the League of Women Voters and independent journalism are all trying to steer in the same direction. So what can we do to ally ourselves but still be at arm's length so that the relationship isn't corrupting unnecessarily?
Yeah, there's a interesting proposal that came out 3 or 4 years ago from the Knight Fellowship, which is a program for mid to later career journalists to have a sabbatical, and they would go to Stanford and they have open enrollment. They can go to any classes they want to. They're not required after the end of their 9 months to come up with a project. They often do though, and it's sort of up to them. Maybe it's a book, maybe it's a precis, maybe it's a monograph, maybe it's some academic effort, but they're meant to take them back to their communities and is better informed and so forth. But a few years ago, this guy from Boise, his proposal was to create a $40 billion fund, which is for Jeff Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk. That's pocket change. They can rattle around in the Soho. And that would create an endowment enough to fund over 1,000 local journalism enterprises, which would be a website and 2 full-time journalists for every 5,000 population, something like that. That would be enough to cover your school board and your city council, and enough to go down to the county hall of records and dig up property records and see who the developers are coming in, and to just check and to keep the flow of information going. Only $40 billion, and that's exactly what Andrew Carnegie did back in whatever year that he sold U.S. Steel in 1912 or whatever it was. The libraries. What else fits the pattern in the same way as the community libraries? And that was all one man in partnership with people from these local communities that built the Ojai Library, that built Foster, what's the name of the library here? Foster? Yeah, I mean, that's a beautiful library. Yeah, beautiful. E.P. Foster Library, yes, very beautiful. So there's patterns and processes that are already in place that are easily adaptable, but this transition away from the advertising supported model and more towards a subscription based model, or more towards a community investment and endowment and news fund that Kevin's been talking about, that can take easily another generation, maybe 2. But it's good that we have these discussions about that and how that might look now, and that we can get that information going. Because there's a fundamental structural impediment to the advertising supported model, because whatever somebody doesn't want you to know is news. Everything else is advertising. Right. If you have a business model that doesn't rely on that, it instantly becomes a little more credible, a little less shaded, a little more willing to push back, a little more willing to go out on a limb, to take a stand. Because if you're worried that any proposal or story that's inimical to the interests of the people who are putting food on your table, it's going to create a problem. I've seen it happen. It's really something you got to be working on all the time.
So just to back that up, so traditionally, news organizations, newspapers would have 20% of their revenue come from membership or subscription, and 80% coming from advertising. Okay, so what's happening now is the model's flipping. But the irony is, when you can make your model based on the community, the members, the people actually giving you money, then the advertisers come back because you have such a great relationship with them and you're such a trusted source that you're credible. So they're like, well, we want to be where the credibility is. Yeah. So,
yeah, I think we've kind of got the lay of the land here as far as community journalism. I feel like a good time to open up for some questions or some back and forth. Yes, ma'am.
I live in the Canal Valley, and I would say 2 or 3 years ago we started receiving a free newspaper. It was delivered on the same day as the Acorn. It was folded and the same size as the Acorn. And sometimes the headlines had some of the same words, but once you read it, it was racist, it was anti-Democratic Party, anti-LGBTQ, which happened, maybe you heard about the incidents of graffiti on an elementary school, and it's called The Guardian. And I'm wondering, are you familiar with it, first of all, and is it distributed county-wide?
No, it's not distributed countywide, and I really don't know the story. You know,
I don't. I've heard about these all over the place. I mean, they are nefarious, and they're designed specifically to fool people.
to muddy the waters.
These are bad actors.
Yeah.
Well, and in the attention deficit society that we live in, where a headline or a picture will cause you to click, rather than saying, excuse me, what's the source here? Like, my rule of thumb with my kids is, if they're quoting another source, don't read it. Go to the source. Click through, find the original piece, and then ask yourself, is this a credible source? And don't share it if it isn't. And they're like, Dad, that'll take so much time. Yeah. It's called work. There is no blue ribbon around, oh, someone's looked at this and it's trusted. No.
That's human nature, to just go where the noise is.
And the funny thing about the First Amendment is we have to allow for language that we don't necessarily agree with. And I fight for people's right to be wrong.
Yeah, it also came through emails. So they bought our list
Yeah.
in Simi Valley. That's how I first read about them, and then deleted them. But it was like, what is this?
Yeah, I'm gonna check that out. Simi Valley Guardian. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
My name is Carol Bradigan. I was involved in Measure A and B, and thank you so much for your great reporting. And one of the things that this prompts as part of your First Amendment goals might be a analysis of these different outlets and news sources so that people can go and find out who's behind them, what is their, what's the background on these sources.
Yeah, you know,
Yes.
I 1000%
Who is
agree.
better positioned with the credibility?
So let me tell you another story, because I believe in being data driven. And the first proposal we went with was an analysis, an objective analysis of the information needs of the entire Ventura County. And it got shut down. And the reason was, we want to put money into content. We don't want to put money into listening or money into data. And the problem with that thinking is it'll get right back to where we are, because who decides the content is the editors or the few people that decide who has the money. If we start with data, like for example, do we really know what the non-English speaking information needs are in Ventura County? I don't. And I've been researching this for a long time. So I think that the ideal situation would be we start with community listening, we do science-based data and research, we look at other places, and then we come up with an information plan and we execute against that plan. That would be the ideal way to go. We may have to do something, we may have to flip the model and start with, why don't we start with a pilot program, see if people are into it, and then we can justify getting the money to do the stuff we needed to do in the first place. But you know, that's the trials and tribulations of running a nonprofit right now.
Yes, ma'am. I love your red blazer. It's very cute.
Thank you. As an adult, I have always taken a print newspaper, always. I lived overseas for 3 years, took the Stars and Stripes, always had a print newspaper. I've taken this Press Courier, now it's the Star, since forever. Since 75, since I came back from overseas. But the Star has eliminated the Saturday delivery. I'm paying about $65 a month for the Star. The content now for local news is almost non-existent anymore. And it's just, I'm really in a quandary as to, do I continue to pay the $65 with no local input? Because that's what I'm most interested in. I'm most interested in local news, not,
Right.
you know, not what the East
Can't
Coast,
get anywhere else.
what US World Report, I think, is what owns the Stars now. Yeah.
USA Today.
And there's another perverse.
Gannett.
Gannett, yeah. There's another perverse program out there now that, Kevin, maybe you remember the name of it, but they call themselves a news organization. They got $200 million on their C round, their C funding, and all they're doing is running mail lists with a program that makes it look like it's, you know, ripped from the headlines of your local community, and here's the stories about, you know, what went on with the new sewer plan or the crash on the 101 and all the rest of that. And you dig into it, it's from the Thousand Oaks Acorn or Simi Valley papers. And they're not paying for this. This is just an aggregator. They're just aggregating local news, and they just paid themselves $200 million. I don't even know what the value is, what percent they sold. Probably over $1 billion. And they're not paying for reporters or photographers or any content. They're just grabbing what's out there already.
So what you're describing is that area just before the news desert, where everything is so fragile that at any one time a raven could come and just pluck it. I can tell you a story. I can't tell you the source. Somebody of influence pulled aside the local VC staff county reporter. His name's Wes
Woods.
And said, "This happened at City Hall. This happened. Why don't you cover it?" And the response was, "My editor said it doesn't get enough clicks." Well, so here's the thing, right? So they don't know who's reading the print. They only know who still buys the paper. So how do we then seek out what kind of influence can we have? Well, first of all, you're part of a group that has tremendous leverage. And I think if you decided that you wanted to come up with a group with, want to support local journalism, we believe in this, but we're calling upon the VC Star and KEYT to increase the amount of local journalism, and we will, I would do that. I would actually leverage it. And I would also seek out other independent local news organizations and try and bolster your news diet together. It's, unless we are actually vocal about this, what's happening is, I think truly a great American institution is dying before our very eyes, and we will then put museums up to the, there was a museum in Washington DC, a museum, that went out of business. I mean, we are throwing away one of the greatest parts of American democracy, and the only way we're going to stop it is every single person in this audience buying local news, being vocal, writing to the paper, and making sure local government also knows that you should be spending your advertising dollars not with a business based in McLean, Virginia, but with businesses that are based here locally, and try and do that influence.
And not Google AdWords either, where you have no idea what the numbers they're telling you are credible at all. When you're dealing with your friends and neighbors, you're already in the same pool of information, and you know whether a message is getting through or not. You have no idea when you support, these, like Google, what's the staff, what's the editorial staff of Google? Does anyone know?
Well, I know
somewhere in the range between 0 and 0.00%.
Oh, okay. So I think, another thing we can do is encourage local news organizations to come together. Through organizations like First Amendment Foundation, but let's all look at our collective needs as an industry, and then also look at our needs for talent and people, and see if we can't come up with a holistic solution where lots of different organizations can come with some support, so that it's not all on the shoulders of one particular organization. That coalition building is really where folks like New Jersey have done this very effectively. Sir.
It sounds like something like PBS, public broadcasting, is a viable model for something like this, rather than over the airways, over the paper, and having the same idea of a grassroots program. We donate to PBS locally, and some of that goes this way, some of it goes that way. And it seems like a reasonable model. That's for something that's already there.
It is an interesting model. Unfortunately, most PBS stations no longer do any local journalism. The local journalism that's being done in broadcast is happening at NPR. So KPCC does more local journalism, I think, or as much as LA Times. And so, and they have Ventura beats. So the models are we're basically federating support to create these structures that create ongoing financial incentives so that both for-profit and non-profit newsrooms can fill the information needs. That's a lot of work, isn't it? Jane?
You were saying that 80% of the income used to come from advertising, and it's now flipped.
In many cases.
Well, and it seems
It's
like
flipping.
the advertising is still, those dollars are still being spent, but they're being spent with social media. And it seems, I'm just wondering if you two have looked into the role of legislation in ensuring that those advertising dollars, which are being paid to organizations that are basically using local news for free, that they have to start paying for it. I mean, it would seem to me that something League of Women Voters can do is work with legislation that would ensure that doesn't happen.
Is a case study in how it took 6 years for New Jersey to pass state and fund. They got like $500,000 that's going to be distributed through the local colleges to new local news organizations. So there's an example of that. I will say it's fantastic they did that. There's two problems. One, it's a drop in the bucket. And two, not every independent news organization wants to take money from the government because they're concerned about the appearance of it. So one thing I think is important to note also, to your point, Jane, advertising dollars traditionally come out of marketing departments. They have metrics, they have to have an ROI, right? So social media is just much more efficient in showing that ROI effectively than display advertising. It just is, okay? There's nothing we're going to be able to do about that. What's starting to happen is a lot of corporations have social mission foundations, or they have community funds. That's where the new advertising dollars are coming from. So instead of it being advertised so we can get X number of eyeballs back to you, it's put your money into here to help support this mission and grow this community. And it's a different ROI completely.
And one that's hard to measure, but you know when it's not there. Yeah, well, it's like Marshall Field, the department store magnate, would spend vast fortunes on advertising. They say, I know half the money I spend is wasted, but now if I could only figure out which half. And that's the conundrum. That's what we're dealing with today. Now people feel like they can figure out which half is being wasted, but you cannot measure community building. You can only measure it when you don't have it. Yes, ma'am.
Had a radio program, and the college got rid of it. And today I don't know what the status is. How do we offer journalism degrees
They turned it
locally?
into a revenue generator. By leasing, becoming a repeater, they basically get funds back from the station that uses them as a repeater. Everything in Ventura, there's one local radio group that's not public radio, of which they have 6 or 7 channels, of which 4 are in Spanish language, and the 2 that are in English, one is religious and the other is super right-wing. But yeah, I mean, the thing is, the state of local journalism in local colleges. First of all, we don't have that many higher institutions in Ventura County. The local colleges have had on and off, but usually it's being driven by a person, a teacher or a resource that really is trying to do this, rather than a systemic way of approaching
One
it.
passionate person.
I know that Cal Lutheran, had a program for a long time, but that is not to say that there aren't great, let's be honest, most people don't necessarily major in journalism that end up journalists. I mean, we can still incentivize people who want to tell the stories of their community to come back and to do so. Maybe their English, maybe their philosophy. But right now the state of J schools locally and journalism locally is pretty sparse, as far as I know.
Just to help answer that question, More Park College does have the More Park College Reporter. They largely focus on like the college and what's going on in the district, but they do some work reporting on the local community. But the program at Oxnard was cut back in 2013 because of state budget cuts. So More Park is currently the only one.
Thank you.
Thanks. Kimberly?
Kevin, I have a question for you. So in the world that you're working in, are you seeing a strategy regarding combating the concerted propaganda effort, which one of those arms is to discredit the press?
Yes. So one of the strategies I'm seeing work is more community listening events, being out in public, being seen. So credibility, showing up at the local farmers market, having a table saying, come up to us and tell us what you're interested in. Being visible and showing that you're invested in the community means that, wait a minute, I don't know what this other garbage is, but I know that that's mine. And I think it really boils down to community activation. And we're seeing this, by the way, not just in news, we see this how brands work now, right? I mean, brands have got more than ever. It's all community driven. So we are great at community in journalism. We know who subscribes, we know who the people are. So being more visible, showing that you advocate for the community, you're there to show to represent the interests. So one of the other things that's interesting about American journalism is this notion of, well, we have to be neutral. But honestly, local news, everybody is an advocate for their community, right? You're not writing against the community, you're writing for the community. And so I think being present, and trying to associate your brand with the health of the community, like every municipality should have a thriving newspaper, and those that do are better for living in. That's the approach. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, I was even talking about like at a national level, a strategy, and even informing the general populace about that. You know, we're seeing the effects of it. Like I think the Guardian paper is part of that.
Well, for example, there was a very interesting congressional hearing a couple of nights ago.
Yeah.
The most popular news channel decided not to air it.
Exactly.
Now, what can we do about that? Right, what can we do about that? Again, I think it's up to the other brands. This is a marketing issue then.
Well, that's what I was asking. If in the world that you're working in, as foul as it is,
I'm not seeing a concerted, like, these are the great talking points, everybody should use them and it'll work. I'm not seeing like Got Milk, right? Remember Got Milk?
Got that strategy.
Yeah.
Like the folks trying to discredit the press and get that propaganda campaign out. They've got that strategy. Is the side that wants strong local press developing that strategy.
Yeah, and look, we are.
It's behind what you're doing too. I mean,
right.
That's part of it, but concerted, organized, so that when folks in Conejo get that Guardian, they just throw it in the trash. They know it's not sourced from anyone that's advocating for their community.
Right. So, for example, if I run a local community news, or the California Community Local News Association, I would be asking them what kind of like branding can we put on the paper to show that we are actually editorially independent and we actually believe in the ethics and the like. And I think we have to put our values up front. We cannot assume that people understand that what we're doing is for their benefit, because clearly it's not working. So I find that journalists are the worst marketers, but we're greatest communicators, right? Because they feel like they shouldn't talk about themselves.
They shouldn't have to. It should be self-evident.
But it isn't. Yes.
Let's see. Oh, I just wanted to pick up on what Kimberly said. I very much agree that local news is like the #1 weapon to confront national propaganda. I mean, 50% of this country is just receiving a diet of Fox News, which is obviously propaganda. And I liked what you said about, being community reporters, being an advocate and a trusted person. And maybe that's a way. I really feel that like half of our country is like basically in a cult. We have to kind of invite them back into the regular media environment, and probably a local journalist is the best access point because it's a trusted person. But I actually do have a question. Actually, I have two. So I had the experience of working with a lot of the folks over at the Ojai Valley News for a couple of years, and the two problems that I confronted was A, people don't want to pay for news. They say, why would I have to pay to read an article about my community? There's not an appreciation for the fact that journalists are professionals who are doing a job. And then secondarily, there's a confusion of what's on Facebook with what is actual news. And I really don't, I think those are the two primary problems at least I confronted, and I would love to hear your thoughts on like how we get people to actually value local news as something you pay for, and how we get people to understand and be discerning about what they see on social media.
That might go back to civics class.
Yeah.
I will I want to clarify one point. Only about less than 50% of the population gets any news. So the fact
of the news.
Right, but this is interesting though, right? If you think about the total potential voting population of the United States, more than 50% bury their head in the sand and don't want any news, and only get their information from Facebook or Nextdoor or their cousins, maybe their wives. So that's a problem, right? Do you want to address the second part of the question?
Which was
Paying for local news and
so this goes to why I'm
that
doing
was the
this,
first part.
right? I mean, it's a grassroots getting out there, reminding people of influence and people who are active that this is not something that we can just take for granted. It's like this, right? When municipalities started, they decided that they needed schools, but not everybody had kids. So what did they do? They put a parcel tax together, and now everybody has a school. So whether you have a kid or not, you have to pay for the schools, right? And people hate taxes. So this is not a tax. We're living in America, land of the free, with liberty and all this stuff. So pay for your freaking news. right?
Well,
This
it's
is your
gonna be-
civic
I
duty.
don't know. I feel the music industry is a canary in the coal mine.
It's a very
With
good
Napster, people aren't going to go back to paying for music in the way that they did before.
But they go to shows and they pay $200
They will
a ticket.
go. Yes, they'll pay Live Nation 50% of their $460 ticket. So you're going to have to start thinking differently about, you know, the revenue and how that works. And maybe, you know, I would hate for things to go back to like this 18th, 19th century model where newspapers were party organs. They were for political hacks, like, you know, how Thomas Jefferson got that reporter to dig up dirt on John Adams, and then he didn't get paid, so then he turned on him and got all the Sally Hemings information out there. What a mess. What a mess.
So one anecdote from this upcoming paper from Free Press. So they looked at what messaging worked, what will get people to actually pay for news. And originally they started with, well, if you don't give money to news, we will go away and democracy will be crap and you'll live in a terrible society. Nobody cared about that. What they cared about is, if you wanted to tell more stories about the museum or the opera, there are so many stories that we can no longer afford to tell. Give more money and we'll add to our culture art, we'll cover our cultural coverage, we'll cover more of these local issues, but you're gonna have to help pay for it. That's when people got involved. It was like this idea that there is so many wonderful stories that aren't being told. Help us tell them. Help us be more inclusive. Let's make a bigger tent, as opposed to we're the people that pay for news and you're all the people that suck off of us. I mean, the public expression. But I think there's it's a marketing and a positioning way where we talk about it about we want local news to be synonymous with the health of the community. Right? That's really what it boils down to. We know that towns and municipalities that have local news have better schools, have more engagement, and the data's out there. I don't have it handy, but it's out there. We just got to tell that story better.
I wonder if they're more affluent communities.
That is another huge problem. Absolutely huge. How do we help communities and serve communities that are underserved and don't have any money? But that's where the subsidies of nonprofits can really help. Unfortunately, what we're seeing is a lot of very successful nonprofits that don't really need the grants, get more grants. So we have to also put some scrutiny on the philanthropy. Why do they keep giving money to the same old projects? Why are they not giving more money to projects serving people of color, not in English language, non-traditional means? That's where the needs are.
They have better grant writers.
That's right. They can afford staff.
That's also inertia. It's inertia. They go with what they know.
So folks like Texas Tribune, has anybody here heard of the Texas Tribune?
Yes. Statewide.
It is considered the #1 nonprofit newsroom. Center for Public Integrity, Center for Investigative Reporting, Reveal, ProPublica. These are all, big nonprofits, and I don't blame them, but they have to publish their salaries. Some of these folks are making for-profit money. You have to keep them.
Anything else? Anyone else want to wrap this up?
This has been such an honor. I so respect your organization. Thank you so very, very much.